Between 1847 and 1923, the Vexley Family Medical Institute in Pittsburgh processed over 2,400 patients, yet hospital records show only 847 official discharges. The brick building on Allegheny Avenue stood as a monument to medical progress, its Gothic Revival architecture casting long shadows across Pittsburgh's industrial landscape. Inside those walls, Dr. Cornelius Vexley and his descendants practiced what they called advanced therapeutic procedures on patients who arrived desperate and departed differently. The few survivors who managed to speak coherently afterward described rooms that smelled of copper and fear, where screams echoed through corridors lined with unmarked doors. What began as Pittsburgh's most prestigious private medical facility became a generational nightmare that the city's elite worked tirelessly to bury alongside its victims. The institution's reputation. The Vexley Family Medical Institute opened its doors on October 15, 1847, in a grand ceremony attended by Pittsburgh's most prominent citizens. Mayor William Johnston cut the ribbon, while Pennsylvania Governor Francis Schenck delivered remarks praising the facility as a beacon of medical advancement for our growing industrial city. The four-story brick edifice on Allegheny Avenue, designed by renowned architect John Chislett, represented everything ambitious about mid-century American medicine. The building's imposing facade featured elaborate stonework and tall windows that gave the structure an air of scholarly authority, while its interior boasted the most modern medical equipment available in the United States. Dr. Cornelius Vexley, the Institute's founder, had arrived in Pittsburgh 3 years earlier with impeccable credentials from the University of Edinburgh and letters of recommendation from prominent European physicians. His reputation preceded him. Colleagues spoke of revolutionary surgical techniques and an almost supernatural ability to diagnose conditions that baffled other doctors. Within months of establishing his practice, Vexley had attracted the attention of Pittsburgh's steel barons and coal magnates, men who valued results over convention. His preliminary consultations were conducted in an ornate office filled with leather-bound medical texts, anatomical models, and scientific instruments that impressed even the most skeptical visitors. The Institute's patient roster read like a directory of Pennsylvania's elite. Railroad tycoon Thomas Scott maintained a standing appointment for his family, often arriving in his private railroad car that was shunted to a special siding near the facility. Coal baron Henry Clay Frick personally recommended Vexley to business associates, crediting the doctor with saving his wife from a mysterious ailment that had puzzled physicians in New York and Philadelphia. Even members of the Mellon banking family sought treatment within the Institute's walls, drawn by reports of miraculous recoveries and Vexley's promise of absolute discretion. The wealthy paid handsomely for Vexley's services, fees that were often 10 times higher than those charged by other physicians, but which guaranteed privacy and access to treatments unavailable elsewhere in America. Cornelius Vexley cultivated an image of scientific rigor mixed with old-world sophistication. He spoke fluent German, French, and Latin, often conducting consultations in multiple languages during the same appointment to accommodate Pittsburgh's diverse immigrant population. His office, decorated with anatomical charts and specimen jars imported from European universities, impressed visitors with its scholarly atmosphere. Medical journals from London, Paris, and Vienna arrived monthly, their pages marked with Vexley's annotations in precise handwriting. The doctor's personal library contained over 3,000 medical texts, many rare first editions that he had acquired during his studies in Edinburgh and subsequent travels throughout Europe. The doctor's son, Dr. Marcus Vexley, joined the practice in 1869 after completing his medical education at Harvard Medical School with highest honors. Father and son worked in remarkable harmony, often finishing each other's diagnoses and sharing an intuitive understanding of complex cases that amazed their colleagues. Marcus brought modern American medical training to complement his father's European background, creating what contemporary observers called the perfect synthesis of old-world wisdom and new-world innovation. The younger Vexley had studied under some of America's most prominent physicians and had spent additional time in German medical facilities, where he learned advanced surgical techniques that were not yet common in American practice. Pittsburgh's medical community initially welcomed the Vexleys with enthusiasm. The Allegheny County Medical Society elected Cornelius as vice president in 1851, and Marcus received similar honors 2 decades later. Both men published papers in prestigious journals such as the American Journal of Medical Sciences and the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, describing novel surgical procedures and pharmaceutical treatments that seemed to achieve miraculous results. Their presentations at medical conferences drew standing ovations and requests for detailed methodologies. The Vexleys became regular speakers at the American Medical Association's annual meetings, where their presentations consistently drew the largest audiences. The Institute's physical expansion reflected its growing reputation and increasing patient demand. In 1858, Cornelius added an east wing containing 6 private surgical suites equipped with the latest medical instruments imported from Germany and England. Each suite featured gas lighting, steam heating, and specialized ventilation systems that were considered revolutionary for their time. The 1874 renovation included a west wing with specialized treatment rooms and what Marcus called therapeutic isolation chambers for patients requiring extended observation. These chambers were designed with thick walls to minimize noise and featured observation windows that allowed staff to monitor patients without disturbance. By 1880, the facility encompassed an entire city block, with underground tunnels connecting various buildings for patient privacy and staff efficiency. The tunnel system allowed patients to be moved between buildings without being seen by the public, which was particularly important for prominent citizens who preferred to keep their medical treatments confidential. The Institute's grounds included carefully manicured gardens, where patients could take therapeutic walks, along with a separate entrance for wealthy clients who arrived in private carriages. The main building featured separate wings for different types of treatments, with the most sensitive procedures conducted in the basement levels, where soundproofing was most effective. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about the Institute's medical advances and social prominence. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a lengthy article in 1862 titled "Local Physicians Pioneer Revolutionary Treatments," praising the Vexleys' work with nervous disorders and constitutional weaknesses that had previously been considered incurable. The Pittsburgh Commercial devoted its entire front page in 1879 to Dr. Marcus Vexley's presentation on modern approaches to hereditary ailments, complete with testimonials from grateful patients whose identities were protected by pseudonyms. The Pittsburgh Dispatch frequently mentioned the Institute in its society columns, noting which prominent families had been seen visiting the facility. The third generation entered the practice when Dr. Augustus Vexley completed his medical training at Johns Hopkins University in 1895, graduating summa cum laude with additional specialization in the emerging fields of neurology and psychiatry. Augustus combined his grandfather's European influences with his father's American innovations and added his own interest in the newest developments in mental health treatment. He had studied under Professor William Osler and had spent 2 years in Vienna working with prominent psychiatrists who were developing groundbreaking approaches to treating mental disorders. Augustus established the Institute's Mental Health Research Division in 1897, attracting patients from across the northeastern United States who sought treatment for conditions that other doctors couldn't address or were reluctant to acknowledge. Pittsburgh's elite trusted the Vexleys with their most sensitive medical concerns, including conditions that could destroy reputations if disclosed publicly. The Institute's patient files contain detailed records of treatments for alcoholism, morphine addiction, sexual disorders, and hereditary conditions that wealthy families preferred to handle privately rather than risk public exposure. The Vexleys' reputation for absolute discretion made them the preferred physicians for problems that could damage social standing or business relationships if disclosed publicly. They treated industrialists suffering from the effects of lead poisoning, society ladies dealing with laudanum addiction, and businessmen struggling with what would later be recognized as stress-related disorders. The institute's staff reflected its prestigious status and demanding standards. The Vexleys employed only the most qualified nurses, many trained at Philadelphia's premier medical schools or recruited from prestigious European hospitals. Their laboratory technicians held advanced degrees from Eastern universities and were paid salaries that exceeded those offered by major hospitals in New York and Boston. Even the facility's groundskeepers and maintenance workers were carefully selected for reliability and discretion, with many serving the institute for decades. Staff members signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements that included significant financial penalties for discussing patient information or institute procedures, and they received generous compensation packages that ensured loyalty and reduced turnover. Medical supply companies competed intensely for contracts with the institute, knowing that Vexley endorsements carried significant weight in professional circles throughout the United States. Pharmaceutical manufacturers frequently provided experimental medications for testing, trusting the Vexley's expertise to evaluate new compounds safely and effectively before wider distribution. The institute served as a testing ground for new medical devices, surgical instruments, and treatment protocols that manufacturers hoped to market to other facilities. Medical equipment companies used Vexley testimonials in their marketing materials, highlighting the institute's reputation for demanding only the finest instruments and devices available. The institute's educational programs attracted medical students from the most prestigious universities in America and Europe. The Vexleys offered limited internship positions that were highly sought after, with applications coming from Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and other elite institutions. Students who completed rotations at the institute often went on to establish successful practices in major cities, carrying forward the Vexley reputation to other regions. The institute's training programs were considered so valuable that some medical schools offered academic credit for time spent studying under the Vexley family, and several prominent physicians credited their success to knowledge gained during their internships at the U facility. By the 1890s, the Vexley Family Medical Institute had become synonymous with medical excellence throughout Western Pennsylvania and beyond. The family's three-generation commitment to advancing medical science, combined with their absolute discretion regarding patient matters, had created an institution that seemed untouchable by criticism or oversight. Pittsburgh's power brokers, business leaders, and social elite viewed the Vexleys not just as physicians, but as guardians of their physical and social well-being. The institute had become an integral part of Pittsburgh's identity as a progressive, modern city that could attract and retain the most talented professionals in any field. Professional medical organizations regularly invited Vexley family members to serve on important committees and editorial boards of major medical journals. Their research papers were cited in textbooks used at major universities throughout the United States and Europe, and medical students learned Vexley techniques as standard procedures. Medical conferences featured Vexley presentations as keynote addresses, with physicians traveling hundreds of miles to attend their sessions and learn about the latest developments in medical science. The institute had transcended its role as a local medical facility to become a nationally recognized center of medical innovation that influenced treatment protocols across the country. The Vexleys' reputation for achieving results where other physicians failed attracted desperate cases from across the United States and even from Europe. Families arrived in Pittsburgh carrying loved ones who had been given up for lost by doctors in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and other major medical centers. The Institute's success stories became legendary in medical circles, with tales of miraculous recoveries and breakthrough treatments that defied conventional understanding. These stories were carefully documented and shared among physicians, further enhancing the Vexley reputation and attracting even more challenging cases to their facility. Ignored signs. The first documented concerns about the Vexley Institute appeared in a private letter dated March 12, 1863, written by Dr. Samuel Richardson of the Western Pennsylvania Hospital to his colleague Dr. Jonathan Miller in Philadelphia. Richardson expressed unease about the unusually high mortality rate among patients transferred from the Vexley facility noting that many arrived in states of extreme agitation and bearing unusual surgical markings that didn't correspond to their documented treatments. Richardson's letter, discovered in Miller's papers in 1923, described patients who seemed fundamentally altered in temperament and mental capacity following their treatment at the Institute. He noted that these patients often displayed an unusual combination of physical trauma and psychological disturbance that he had never encountered in his 20 years of medical practice. Sarah Mitchell, a seamstress from Pittsburgh's South Side, became one of the earliest documented cases of suspicious circumstances surrounding the Institute. In September 1864, Sarah's family delivered her to the Vexleys for treatment of female hysteria, a common diagnosis for women experiencing emotional distress following personal trauma. After 6 weeks of treatment, Sarah returned home displaying severe behavioral changes that alarmed her family and neighbors. Her sister, Margaret Wells, later wrote in her diary that Sarah speaks of terrible things done in underground rooms and bears scars that were not there before her treatment. Margaret's diary entries, preserved by her descendants, described Sarah as becoming increasingly withdrawn and fearful, particularly of medical professionals and basement areas. Sarah disappeared permanently in November 1864, leaving behind only a note stating she could not live with what they made me become. Her family searched extensively for her, hiring private investigators and offering rewards for information about her whereabouts. The Pittsburgh police conducted a brief investigation, but concluded that Sarah had likely committed suicide, despite the lack of a body or concrete evidence. Margaret Wells spent the remainder of her life believing that her sister had been murdered to prevent her from revealing what had occurred during her treatment at the Institute. The Pennsylvania Railroad kept meticulous records of passenger manifests, and these documents revealed troubling patterns regarding Vexley Institute patients. Between 1865 and 1875, over 200 individuals purchased one-way tickets to Pittsburgh specifically to seek treatment at the Institute, often traveling from distant cities based on recommendations from physicians or family members. However, railroad records show fewer than 60 return tickets purchased by these same individuals during the subsequent 5 years. When questioned by a Pennsylvania Railroad investigator in 1876, Dr. Marcus Vexley explained that many patients chose to remain in Pittsburgh to their recovery process or relocated to other cities for family reasons. The railroad investigator John Thompson found this explanation unsatisfactory and conducted his own inquiry into the missing passengers. Thompson's private notes, found among his personal effects in 1889, revealed that he had attempted to locate several of these missing individuals and had been unable to find any trace of them in Pittsburgh or surrounding areas. Thompson noted that the Vexley Institute's explanations for patient disappearances seemed rehearsed and evasive, and that Institute staff appeared unusually nervous when questioned about specific patients. His investigation was ultimately abandoned when the Pennsylvania Railroad received complaints from influential Pittsburgh businessmen about harassment of respected medical professionals. Dr. Robert Anderson, a physician practicing in nearby Allegheny City, began maintaining unofficial records of concerning reports about the Vexley Institute in 1871. His private journal, discovered in 1947 among his estate papers, documents conversations with colleagues, patients, and community members who expressed disturbing suspicions about the Institute's practices. Anderson noted that former Vexley patients exhibit behavioral patterns inconsistent with successful medical treatment, and that an unusual number of these individuals seem to have suffered significant memory impairment regarding their time at the facility. Anderson's journal entries became increasingly detailed and concerned as he encountered more cases of former Vexley patients displaying similar symptoms. Anderson documented over 30 cases of former Vexley patients who exhibited what he described as profound personality alterations following their treatment. These individuals often seemed subdued and fearful, displayed unusual physical scars that didn't correspond to their documented medical conditions, and frequently suffered from nightmares and memory problems. Anderson noted that many of these patients seemed reluctant to discuss their experiences at the institute and would become agitated or distressed when pressed for details about their treatment. Several patients told Anderson that they had signed agreements requiring them to speak positively about their treatment or face legal consequences. The institute's relationship with local morgues and funeral homes raised questions among undertakers who handled bodies released from Vexley care. James Franklin, who operated Franklin Funeral Services on Liberty Avenue, kept detailed records of bodies received from various medical facilities as part of his standard business practices. His ledgers show that corpses from the Vexley Institute frequently displayed anatomical irregularities and post-mortem alterations that Franklin found difficult to explain using standard medical knowledge. In several cases, Franklin noted that bodies appeared to have undergone procedures that weren't mentioned in the official death certificates provided by the Institute. Franklin's records, maintained from 1867 to 1889, documented 23 bodies received from the Vexley Institute that showed evidence of surgical procedures performed shortly before death. These procedures often involved organ removal or modification that seemed unrelated to the patient's documented medical conditions. Franklin noted that several bodies appeared to have been subjected to experimental surgical techniques that left unusual scarring patterns and anatomical alterations. When Franklin attempted to discuss these observations with other undertakers, he found that most were reluctant to comment on Vexley Institute cases, citing concerns about losing business from prominent families. Local law enforcement received scattered reports throughout the 1870s and 1880s from family members who claimed their relatives had been fundamentally changed by treatment at the Vexley Institute. These complaints typically involved allegations that patients returned home with altered personalities, missing memories, or unexplained physical modifications that family members couldn't understand. Pittsburgh Police Captain Charles Baker documented these reports in a special file that he maintained separately from official police records, noting that the complainants often seemed credible but lacked concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Baker's private files, discovered in 1932, contained over 40 reports from family members expressing concerns about relatives who had received treatment at the institute. These reports described patients returning home with significant behavioral changes, including increased docility, memory problems, and unusual fears or phobias that hadn't existed before their treatment. Several families reported that their relatives seemed to have lost specific memories or skills that they had possessed before entering the institute. Baker noted that complainants often struggle to articulate specific grievances, and that the Vexley Institute's reputation makes such accusations difficult to pursue without concrete evidence. The Institute's employment practices began attracting attention from labor organizers in the 1880s as Pittsburgh's labor movement gained strength. Several former staff members approached union representatives with stories about unusual working conditions and concerning patient treatment protocols that violated standard medical practices. However, these employees had signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements that threatened severe financial penalties for discussing institute operations with anyone outside the facility. The agreements included clauses that would have bankrupted most workers if enforced, creating a powerful deterrent against speaking publicly about institute practices. Most potential whistleblowers ultimately declined to make formal statements, citing fears about their family's economic security and personal safety. Union organizer William Harris documented several conversations with former institute employees who described witnessing disturbing procedures but were too frightened to provide detailed testimony. Harris noted that these workers seemed genuinely traumatized by their experiences and that their descriptions of institute practices were consistent across multiple sources. However, Harris was unable to convince any of these workers to make public statements that could be used to challenge the Institute's operations. Dr. Edward Collins, who served as coroner for Allegheny County from 1878 to 1892, maintained private records of deaths he investigated that showed connections to the Vexley Institute. Collins documented 47 cases where individuals who had received treatment at the institute died under circumstances he considered medically suspicious within 6 months of their discharge. These deaths typically involved unexplained organ failures, sudden cardiac events, or suicides that occurred without apparent warning signs or precipitating factors. Collins noted that many of these deaths involved individuals who had shown signs of recovery during their treatment at the institute, making their subsequent deterioration particularly puzzling. Collins's private autopsy notes revealed that several of these individuals had undergone surgical procedures that weren't documented in their medical records or death certificates. He found evidence of organ removal, surgical modifications to brain tissue, and other procedures that seemed unrelated to the patient's documented medical conditions. Collins attempted to raise concerns about these findings with other medical professionals, but found that his colleagues were reluctant to challenge the Vexley Institute's practices. Several prominent physicians warned Collins that pursuing his investigation could damage his career and reputation within Pittsburgh's medical community. The Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh received numerous reports from parishioners expressing concerns about family members who had sought treatment at the Vexley Institute. Father Joseph Carter, who served at St. Patrick's Church on the North Side, kept detailed records of confessions and counseling sessions related to these concerns. His private notes, sealed in church archives until 1995, describe parishioners' reports of relatives returning from the institute with spiritual darkness and memories of blasphemous procedures that traumatized both patients and their families. Father Carter noted that these reports came from credible parishioners who had no apparent motive for fabricating such disturbing accounts. Father Carter's records documented over 25 families who sought spiritual guidance after a family member received treatment at the institute. These families often reported that their relatives seemed to have lost their faith or developed an aversion to religious practices that had previously been important to them. Several patients told family members about procedures that they believed violated religious principles, including what they described as deliberate attempts to test or break their spiritual beliefs. Father Carter noted that many of these patients seemed to be suffering from profound spiritual trauma that traditional counseling methods couldn't address. Medical supply companies occasionally reported irregularities in orders placed by the Vexley Institute that didn't correspond to standard medical practices. Between 1883 and 1887, the Institute ordered unusually large quantities of specific surgical instruments, restraint devices, and pharmaceutical compounds that seemed inconsistent with their documented patient treatments. Sales representatives from medical supply companies noted that the Vexley Institute often requested specialized equipment that was typically used in experimental research rather than standard patient care. When questioned about these orders, Augustus Vexley explained that the Institute was conducting advanced research projects that required specialized equipment for experimental therapeutic procedures not yet available to the general medical community. Supply company records showed that the Institute regularly ordered surgical instruments designed for procedures that weren't commonly performed in American medical facilities. These included specialized restraint systems, surgical tools for brain surgery, and pharmaceutical compounds that were still in experimental stages. Sales representatives noted that Institute staff often insisted on modifications to standard equipment that made the devices more suitable for restraining patients or conducting procedures without patient cooperation. Several suppliers expressed private concerns about the nature of these orders, but continued to fulfill them due to the substantial profits involved and the Institute's reputation for prompt payment. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board received its first formal complaint about the Vexley Institute in 1889 from Dr. Frank Reynolds, a physician practicing in Erie who had treated several former Vexley patients. Reynolds alleged that he had treated 3 former Vexley patients who displayed evidence of unauthorized surgical procedures and psychological trauma inconsistent with legitimate medical treatment. The medical board investigated these allegations through a committee of prominent physicians who reviewed Reynolds' evidence and interviewed the affected patients. However, The committee concluded that Reynolds' evidence was insufficient to substantiate claims of professional misconduct, and that the Vexley Institute's exemplary reputation argues against the likelihood of such practices. Reynolds' complaint included detailed medical records documenting surgical scars and anatomical modifications that he couldn't explain through legitimate medical procedures. The patients Reynolds had examined displayed evidence of brain surgery, organ removal, and other procedures that weren't mentioned in their medical records from the Institute. Reynolds noted that these patients also suffered from severe psychological trauma and memory problems that suggested they had been subjected to experimental procedures without their knowledge or consent. However, the medical board's investigation focused more on protecting the profession's reputation than on thoroughly examining Reynolds' evidence. Local newspapers occasionally published letters to the editor raising questions about the Institute, though these were typically relegated to back pages and written anonymously to protect the writers from potential retaliation. The Pittsburgh Commercial received a letter in 1891, signed only as a concerned citizen, that described strange sounds emanating from the Vexley Institute during nighttime hours and unusual numbers of unmarked wagons arriving and departing under cover of darkness. The letter described screams and other disturbing sounds that could be heard from the Institute's basement levels during late-night hours when normal medical procedures wouldn't typically be conducted. The newspaper's editors noted that they could not verify the accuracy of these claims and suggested that readers should be cautious about accepting unsubstantiated allegations against respected medical professionals. However, the editors received several similar letters over the following months, all describing unusual activities at the Institute during nighttime hours. These letters described unmarked carriages arriving at odd hours, strange lights in basement windows, and sounds that suggested activities inconsistent with normal medical practice. Despite the consistency of these reports, the newspaper declined to investigate further, citing concerns about damaging relationships with prominent advertisers and subscribers. Insurance companies began tracking unusual patterns in claims related to Vexley Institute patients during the 1890s as they developed more sophisticated methods for analyzing risk factors. Equitable Life Assurance Society of the United States noted in internal memoranda that death benefit claims for former Vexley patients occurred at rates significantly higher than actuarial predictions suggested. These claims often involved deaths that occurred months or years after treatment, but exhibited patterns that insurance investigators found statistically anomalous and medically puzzling. The company's chief medical examiner noted that former Vexley patients seemed to experience unusually high rates of organ failure, suicide, and unexplained deaths compared to patients treated at other medical facilities. However, the claims were ultimately paid because the deaths occurred sufficiently long after treatment to avoid direct liability issues, and the insurance companies were reluctant to challenge the Vexley Institute's medical practices without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Insurance investigators noted that attempts to obtain detailed medical records from the Institute were often unsuccessful, with requests being denied based on patient confidentiality concerns. Several insurance companies began requiring additional medical examinations for applicants who had received treatment at the Institute, but these policies were quietly implemented to avoid conflict with Pittsburgh's medical establishment. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the Vexley Institute's facade appeared on the morning of April 3, 1898, when groundskeeping staff discovered human remains while excavating for a new garden on the Institute's south grounds. Thomas Lambert, the head groundskeeper who had worked at the facility for over 15 years, later testified that he found bone fragments and surgical implements buried together in what appeared to be organized disposal sites. The discovery included not only human remains, but also surgical instruments, restraint devices, and personal belongings that appeared to have been hastily buried. Lambert immediately reported his discovery to Dr. Augustus Vexley, who assured him that these were anatomical specimens from legitimate research activities and ordered the remains reburied without further investigation. Lambert had always been a loyal employee who prided himself on maintaining the institute's grounds to the highest standards. However, the discovery of human remains in what should have been pristine garden soil deeply troubled him. Over the following days, Lambert conducted his own careful examination of the burial site and discovered evidence suggesting that the remains had been placed there recently rather than being historical anatomical. Specimens. The bones showed signs of fresh surgical cuts, and several personal items included dates that indicated they belonged to recent patients rather than historical research subjects. Lambert's conscience troubled him for months following this incident. In September 1898, he contacted his parish priest, Father Walter Green, and described what he had witnessed on the institute grounds. Father Green encouraged Lambert to approach civil authorities, but Lambert feared losing his employment and endangering his family's financial security. Lambert was the sole provider for his wife and 4 children, and the institute's generous salary allowed his family to live comfortably in a way that would be impossible if he lost his position. Instead, Lambert began secretly documenting additional suspicious activities he observed during his work at the institute, creating a detailed journal that would later become crucial evidence. Lambert's journal entries revealed a pattern of disturbing activities that he had previously dismissed as normal medical procedures. He documented the regular arrival of unmarked wagons during nighttime hours, the removal of large quantities of materials that appeared to be human remains, and the sounds of construction activity in basement areas that were supposedly off-limits to groundskeeping staff. Lambert noted that certain areas of the Institute's grounds seemed to be regularly disturbed and replanted, suggesting ongoing burial and removal activities. He also observed that Institute staff members seemed unusually nervous around groundskeeping personnel and often interrupted outdoor work activities without clear justification. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In February 1899, fire damaged the Institute's east wing, forcing the evacuation of patients and staff from that section of the building. The fire began in the early morning hours when most patients were asleep and spread quickly through the building's wooden interior structures. During the emergency evacuation, several locked rooms were opened that had previously been restricted to family members only. Pittsburgh Fire Captain Richard Coleman and his crew discovered what they described as treatment rooms containing restraint devices and surgical equipment inconsistent with standard medical practice. Captain Coleman, a veteran firefighter with over 20 years of experience, had seen many medical facilities during emergency responses, but the rooms in the Vexley Institute's East Wing were unlike anything he had encountered. The rooms contained surgical tables equipped with heavy leather restraints, collections of surgical instruments that seemed designed for procedures far more invasive than standard medical. Treatment and observation areas that suggested the rooms were designed for viewing rather than providing medical care. Coleman noted that several rooms contained what appeared to be experimental equipment for administering electrical shocks and other procedures that didn't correspond to any medical treatments he was familiar with. Captain Coleman's official fire department report, filed on February 18, 1899, documented the discovery of surgical tables equipped with unusual restraint mechanisms, collections of surgical instruments not typically found in standard medical facilities, and patient observation rooms designed to prevent escape rather than provide comfort. Coleman noted that the rooms contained evidence of recent use and biological materials that appeared to be human tissue and fluids. The report described drainage systems that seemed designed to dispose of large quantities of bodily fluids and ventilation systems that suggested the rooms were used for procedures that produced strong odors or potentially harmful vapors. The fire department's discoveries prompted the first official investigation of the Vexley Institute. Allegheny County District Attorney Carl Bennett, under pressure from public concerns raised by the fire department's report, assigned prosecutor Albert Fisher to examine the circumstances surrounding the fire and the materials discovered during the emergency response. Fisher's investigation began as a routine inquiry into potential building code violations, but quickly expanded as evidence mounted suggesting systematic criminal activity spanning decades. Fisher, a meticulous investigator with a reputation for pursuing difficult cases, approached the investigation with an open mind, but growing concern about what he might discover. Fisher's most significant breakthrough came when he located and interviewed Raymond Elliott, a former Institute employee who had worked as a surgical assistant from 1892 to 1897. Elliott had been dismissed from his position for what Augustus Vexley described as reliability issues. But Fisher discovered that Elliott had actually been terminated for questioning procedures he witnessed during his employment. Elliott had initially been recruited for his technical skills and had signed a comprehensive confidentiality agreement that prevented him from discussing his experiences, but Fisher obtained a court order compelling his testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Elliott's testimony, recorded in transcripts that remained sealed until 1967, described systematic patient abuse that he witnessed during his 5 years at the Institute. Elliott testified that the Vexley family conducted experimental procedures on patients without their knowledge or consent, including surgical modifications designed to alter behavior and personality. He described witnessing procedures that appeared designed to cause specific types of psychological trauma and surgical alterations that had no legitimate medical purpose. Elliott's testimony was particularly credible because he could provide detailed technical descriptions of the procedures he had witnessed and could identify specific equipment and techniques that were later confirmed by physical evidence. According to Elliott's testimony, the Institute maintained 2 completely separate sets of patient records: official files that documented standard medical treatments for external review and confidential files that detailed the actual procedures performed on patients. Elliott stated that he had access to both sets of records during his employment and observed that the confidential files described procedures that would be considered torture rather than medicine. He testified that the Vexley family deliberately selected patients who were unlikely to be missed or whose families could be convinced to accept unusual explanations for treatment. Outcomes. The selection process often targeted individuals with limited family support, mental health issues that could be used to discredit their testimony, or financial desperation that made them vulnerable to exploitation. The investigation expanded when Fisher discovered that Thomas Lambert had been maintaining his secret journal of suspicious activities at the Institute. Lambert's journal, covering the period from 1895 to 1899, documented numerous incidents that corroborated Elliott's testimony and provided additional evidence of criminal activity. Lambert wrote about screams emanating from basement rooms during nighttime hours, unmarked wagons arriving to collect materials that appeared to be human remains, and patients who entered the Institute voluntarily but required restraints and sedation when being transported to other locations. Lambert's observations were particularly valuable because they came from someone who had regular access to the Institute's grounds and could document patterns of activity over extended periods. Lambert's journal revealed that the Institute operated on 2 distinct schedules: daytime activities that could be observed by visitors and staff, and nighttime activities that were conducted in secret with only a small number of trusted personnel. Lambert noted that certain areas of the building were regularly cleaned with unusual thoroughness following nighttime activities, suggesting that procedures conducted during these hours produced evidence that needed to be carefully eliminated. He also documented the regular disposal of large quantities of materials that appeared to be human remains, medical waste, and equipment that showed signs of having been used for purposes other than standard medical care. Fisher's investigation uncovered financial records, suggesting that the Vexley Institute received payments from sources beyond standard medical fees. Bank records showed regular deposits from accounts linked to medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and private research organizations that had no apparent connection to patient care. These payments appeared to compensate the Institute for providing research subjects and experimental data, rather than standard patient care services. The amounts involved were substantial, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in contemporary currency, and were carefully disguised through a complex network of shell companies and intermediary accounts that made their true sources difficult to trace. The discovery of the Institute's true patient records provided the most damning evidence against the Vexley family. These confidential files, hidden in a vault beneath the Institute's main building, documented systematic experimentation on over 800 patients between 1873 and 1898. The records described procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance, surgical alterations intended to modify personality and behavior, and pharmaceutical experiments using untested compounds on unwilling subjects. The files contained detailed notes about patient responses to various forms of torture, surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia to study pain responses, and experiments designed to test the effectiveness of different methods for breaking psychological resistance. One particularly disturbing set of records detailed what Augustus Vexley termed generational studies, which involved treating multiple members of the same family to observe hereditary responses to various procedures. These studies typically began with one family member seeking legitimate medical care, but expanded to include siblings, parents, and children who were brought to the Institute under false pretenses. The records showed that entire families were subjected to coordinated experimentation designed to test theories about inherited psychological and physical characteristics. The Vexleys documented their observations about how different family members responded to identical procedures, creating a database of information about genetic factors that influenced human responses to trauma and medical intervention. The confidential files revealed that the Vexley family maintained detailed correspondence with physicians and researchers across the United States and Europe. These letters discussed sharing experimental data, coordinating research protocols, and arranging transfers of patients between facilities. The correspondence suggested that the Vexley Institute was part of an informal network of medical facilities conducting similar unauthorized human experimentation, with each institution specializing in different types of procedures and research objectives. The letters included discussions about best practices for maintaining secrecy, methods for disposing of evidence, and techniques for ensuring patient compliance with experimental procedures. Gauntient testimonies began emerging as Fisher's investigation became public knowledge. Survivors who had been too frightened or confused to speak previously began coming forward with accounts of their experiences at the Institute. These testimonies described being deceived about the nature of their treatments, subjected to procedures without consent, and threatened with consequences if they disclosed their experiences after discharge. Many survivors reported ongoing physical and psychological problems that they directly attributed to their treatment at the Institute. The consistency of these testimonies, despite coming from individuals who had no contact with each other, provided strong evidence that the abuse described was systematic rather than isolated incidents. Louise Ellis testified that she had been admitted to the Institute in 1891 for treatment of nervous exhaustion following the death of her husband. Ellis described being subjected to surgical procedures that served no medical purpose and psychological manipulations designed to alter her emotional responses. She stated that she was kept at the Institute for 8 months longer than originally planned and was told that her family had abandoned her when she asked about going home. Ellis testified that she was released only after agreeing to sign documents stating that she had received excellent care and would recommend the Institute to others. Her testimony included detailed descriptions of procedures that were later confirmed by physical evidence found at the Institute. The investigation revealed that the Vexley family had developed sophisticated methods for selecting and acquiring patients who could be exploited without significant risk of exposure. They particularly targeted individuals with limited family support, those suffering from conditions that could justify extended treatment periods, and patients whose mental state could be questioned if they later made accusations about their care. The Institute also actively recruited patients from distant locations, making it difficult for families to monitor treatment progress or investigate concerns about their relatives' conditions. The Vexleys maintained relationships with physicians in other cities who would refer difficult cases to Pittsburgh, often without fully understanding the nature of the treatment their patients would receive. Medical records showed that the Vexley family had been conducting unauthorized pharmaceutical experiments since the 1880s, using patients as test subjects for compounds provided by drug manufacturers. These experiments often involved administering multiple experimental substances simultaneously to observe interaction effects, with no regard for patient safety or informed consent. The records documented numerous deaths directly attributed to these pharmaceutical experiments, though the official death certificates listed other causes to avoid scrutiny. The experiments included testing of various poisons, hallucinogenic substances, and compounds designed to alter brain function or behavior. The investigation uncovered evidence that the Institute had been selling organs and tissue samples harvested from patients during unauthorized procedures. Correspondence with medical schools and research facilities showed regular transactions involving anatomical specimens and tissue samples that the Vexley family claimed were obtained from patients who had died of natural causes. However, the confidential patient records revealed that many of these specimens were actually harvested from living patients during non-consensual surgical procedures. The sales provided substantial additional income for the Institute, while supporting research at legitimate medical institutions that may not have fully understood the source of the materials they were purchasing. Fisher's investigation documented systematic psychological torture that the Vexley family conducted under the guise of psychiatric treatment. Patients were subjected to sensory deprivation, forced isolation, sleep deprivation, and other techniques designed to break down their mental resistance and make them more compliant with experimental procedures. The confidential records described these techniques as preparatory protocols necessary to optimize patient responsiveness to subsequent experimental treatments. The psychological torture often continued for weeks or months before patients were subjected to physical procedures, creating a systematic process of dehumanization that made it easier for staff to participate in the abuse. The scope of the Vexley family's criminal activities became clear as Fisher compiled evidence from multiple sources. The investigation revealed that over 2,400 individuals had been admitted to the Institute between 1847 and 1899, but fewer than 900 could be accounted for through legitimate discharges or documented deaths. The fate of the remaining 1,500 patients remained unknown, though evidence suggested that many had died during experimental procedures or had been transferred to other facilities without their consent or knowledge. Fisher's investigation also revealed that the Institute had maintained detailed records of successful techniques for disposing of bodies and eliminating evidence, suggesting that the missing patients had likely been murdered and their remains destroyed or disposed of in ways that prevented discovery. Legacy and silence. The investigation into the Vexley Institute faced immediate and powerful resistance from Pittsburgh's establishment. Within days of Fisher's preliminary findings becoming public, District Attorney Carl Bennett received pressure from city officials, business leaders, and prominent families who had connections to the Institute. Mayor William Kennedy called Bennett to express concern that sensationalized allegations might damage Pittsburgh's reputation and discourage business investment in the region. Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie personally visited Bennett's office to suggest that unsubstantiated claims against respected physicians could harm the city's economic development efforts. These interventions were carefully coordinated to present a united front of Pittsburgh's most influential citizens defending the Institute's reputation. Bennett found himself in an impossible position as pressure mounted from multiple directions simultaneously. Bank presidents threatened to withdraw support for city bonds if the investigation continued to receive public attention. Railroad executives suggested that continued negative publicity might affect their willingness to maintain major operations in Pittsburgh. Coal and steel company owners argued that attacks on the city's medical establishment could discourage skilled workers from relocating to Pittsburgh, harming the entire industrial economy. Bennett received dozens of letters from prominent citizens expressing concern about the investigation's potential impact on Pittsburgh's national reputation. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and other local newspapers initially covered Fisher's investigation, but their reporting became increasingly restrained as evidence mounted against the Vexley family. Editor Harold Price later admitted in private correspondence that advertisers and influential subscribers expressed strong concerns about continued coverage of allegations that might prove damaging to prominent local families. The newspapers gradually shifted their focus to questioning the credibility of witnesses and emphasizing the lack of definitive proof, rather than investigating the substantial evidence Fisher had uncovered. Articles began appearing that portrayed the investigation as a politically motivated attack on respected physicians, based on unreliable testimony from disgruntled former employees and mentally unstable former patients. Rice's private correspondence, discovered in 1954, revealed the extent of pressure placed on Pittsburgh's media outlets to suppress coverage of the investigation. Major advertisers threatened to withdraw their accounts if newspapers continued to publish sensationalized allegations against the Institute. Prominent subscribers canceled subscriptions and organized boycotts of businesses that advertised in newspapers that continued to cover the story. Political leaders suggested that continued coverage could harm relationships between newspaper owners and city officials, potentially affecting the newspaper's access to official information and their ability to operate effectively within the city. Dr. Augustus Vexley's response to the investigation demonstrated the family's sophisticated understanding of legal and political maneuvering developed over decades of operating outside normal oversight. Rather than denying the allegations outright, Vexley retained Pittsburgh's most prominent legal firm and launched a coordinated campaign to discredit key witnesses and evidence. The Institute's attorneys argued that disgruntled former employees and mentally unstable former patients were making false accusations motivated by personal grievances and financial opportunism. The defense strategy focused on attacking the credibility of individual witnesses rather than addressing the systematic evidence of criminal activity that Fisher had compiled. The legal challenge to Fisher's investigation gained momentum when defense attorneys successfully argued that much of the evidence had been obtained through improper search procedures. The confidential patient records, which contained the most damning evidence against the Vexley family, were ruled inadmissible in court because they had been discovered during the fire department's emergency response rather than through a properly executed search warrant. This legal technicality effectively eliminated the prosecution's strongest evidence and made conviction unlikely. The ruling set a precedent that made it difficult for investigators to use evidence discovered during emergency situations, creating a legal shield that protected other institutions engaged in similar activities. Defense attorneys also challenged the admissibility of witness testimony on grounds that the witnesses had been coerced or compensated for their statements. They argued that Raymond Elliott and other former employees had been offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for their testimony, making their statements unreliable. The defense portrayed Thomas Lambert as a disgruntled employee seeking to cause trouble for his former employers, despite the fact that Lambert had worked for the Institute for over 15 years without previous complaints. These legal challenges created delays that allowed time for additional pressure to be applied to witnesses and for evidence to disappear or be destroyed. Key witnesses began disappearing or recanting their testimony as the case proceeded through the legal system. Thomas Lambert, whose journal had provided crucial corroborating evidence, left Pittsburgh suddenly in March 1900 after receiving what he described as threats against his family's safety. Lambert relocated to California and refused to return to Pennsylvania to testify, claiming that he feared for his life if he remained involved in the case. His journal was subsequently ruled inadmissible as hearsay evidence since Lambert wasn't available for cross-examination. Lambert's family later reported that he never fully recovered from the trauma of what he had witnessed at the Institute and struggled with nightmares and paranoia for the remainder of his life. Raymond Elliott, the former surgical assistant whose testimony had initially broken the case open, began experiencing what physicians described as severe nervous disorders that made him appear unreliable as a witness. Elliott's family reported that he suffered from nightmares, memory lapses, and periods of intense paranoia following his initial testimony. Defense attorneys successfully argued that Elliott's mental state made his testimony unreliable and medical experts testified that his condition was consistent with someone fabricating elaborate stories for attention or financial gain. Elliot was eventually committed to a mental institution where he remained until his death in 1923, never again speaking publicly about his experiences at the Vexley Institute. Several other witnesses experienced similar problems that undermined their credibility and availability for testimony. Louise Ellis, who had provided detailed testimony about her experiences as a patient, began experiencing severe health problems that prevented her from appearing in court. Dr. Samuel Richardson, whose 1863 letter had provided early evidence of problems at the Institute, died suddenly of a heart attack in 1901, just days before he was scheduled to testify. Father Joseph Carter, whose records documented parishioner concerns about the Institute, was transferred to a remote parish in rural Pennsylvania and was no longer available to provide testimony about his documentation of the Institute's impact on local families. The investigation suffered additional setbacks when evidence began disappearing from prosecutors' offices and court facilities. Files containing witness statements, financial records, and physical evidence were reported missing or destroyed under mysterious circumstances. Fisher reported that his office was burglarized 3 times during the investigation, with thieves specifically targeting case-related materials while leaving valuable items untouched. Court clerks reported similar incidents, and several key pieces of evidence simply vanished from secure storage areas. Security guards reported seeing unfamiliar individuals in courthouse areas during nighttime hours, but these intruders were never identified or apprehended. Fisher's attempts to reconstruct missing evidence were hampered by the systematic destruction of related materials at other locations. Bank records that had documented unusual financial transactions involving the Institute were reported destroyed in a fire at the bank's record storage facility. Medical supply company records that had shown unusual orders from the Institute were lost when the company's warehouse was burglarized. Insurance company files that had documented unusual patterns in claims related to Institute patients were destroyed when the insurance company's offices were flooded due to a burst water pipe. The consistent pattern of evidence destruction suggested a coordinated effort to eliminate materials that could support the prosecution's case. By late 1900, the formal prosecution of the Vexley family had collapsed due to lack of admissible evidence and available witnesses. District Attorney Bennett announced that while irregularities may have occurred at the Vexley Institute, insufficient credible evidence exists to sustain criminal charges against the defendants. The announcement sparked outrage among surviving victims and their families, but legal appeals were unsuccessful in reviving the prosecution. Bennett later admitted in private correspondence that he had been forced to abandon the case due to political pressure rather than lack of evidence, but he refused to make this admission publicly during his lifetime. The announcement of the case's dismissal was carefully orchestrated to minimize public attention and criticism. Bennett made the announcement on a Friday afternoon during a major snowstorm that kept most reporters away from the courthouse. The announcement was buried in back pages of newspapers that focused their coverage on weather-related stories and other news. Public reaction was limited because most citizens had only limited knowledge of the investigation's findings, and the lack of detailed media coverage prevented widespread understanding of what had actually occurred at the Institute. The Vexley family's response to the failed prosecution was swift and comprehensive. Dr. Augustus Vexley announced the permanent closure of the Institute in December 1900, citing the traumatic impact of false allegations on staff and patients. The Institute's assets were liquidated through private sales to undisclosed buyers, with most equipment and materials sold to medical facilities in other states where their origins could be concealed. The main building was demolished in early 1901 to make way for commercial development, though no development occurred on the site for over 20 years. The demolition was completed with unusual speed and thoroughness, eliminating any physical evidence that might have supported future investigations. The demolition process itself raised additional questions about the extent of the Institute's criminal activities. Workers reported finding extensive underground facilities that hadn't been documented in building plans or city records. These underground areas contained equipment and materials that suggested activities far beyond what had been revealed during the investigation. However, workers were required to sign confidentiality agreements and were closely supervised to ensure that no evidence was removed or documented. The underground facilities were filled with concrete and sealed permanently, eliminating any possibility of future excavation or investigation. Most surviving Institute records were reported destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1902, just months before a federal investigation was scheduled to begin. The fire was attributed to electrical problems in aging warehouse facilities, but witnesses reported that the blaze began simultaneously in multiple locations and burned with unusual intensity. Federal investigators found only charred fragments of what had once been extensive documentation of the Institute's operations and patient treatments. The fire occurred during a period when federal authorities were beginning to take interest in reports about unauthorized medical experimentation, making the timing particularly suspicious. The warehouse fire was investigated by both local and federal authorities, but no evidence of arson was ever established. However, witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar individuals near the warehouse on the night before the fire, and security guards reported that locks on warehouse doors appeared to have been tampered with. Insurance investigators noted that the fire burned unusually hot and seemed to have been designed to ensure complete destruction of stored materials. The insurance company paid claims related to the fire, but noted in internal documents that the circumstances suggested deliberate destruction rather than accidental fire. The Vexley family members dispersed across the country following the Institute's closure, apparently following a coordinated plan to avoid further investigation. Dr. Augustus Vexley relocated to San Francisco, where he established a small private practice under an assumed name and continued treating patients until his death in 1918. Dr. Marcus Vexley moved to New Orleans and continued practicing medicine until his death in 1908, maintaining a low profile and avoiding any activities that might attract attention from law enforcement. Dr. Cornelius Vexley, now in his 80s, retreated to a private residence in Florida and avoided all contact with former associates or investigators until his death in 1905. The dispersal of the Vexley family was facilitated by a network of supporters who provided new identities, financial support, and professional references that allowed them to practicing medicine in other locations. Medical licenses were obtained through influential contacts who vouched for their qualifications, without mentioning their connection to the Pittsburgh Institute. Professional associations accepted the family members based on their published research and reputation within the medical community, apparently without conducting thorough background investigations that might have revealed their connection to the failed prosecution. Surviving patients and their families found themselves isolated and without legal recourse as the case collapsed. Many had already suffered financial hardship due to lost income and ongoing medical expenses related to their institute experiences. The failure of the prosecution eliminated any possibility of compensation or official acknowledgement of their suffering. Several survivors committed suicide in the years following the failed investigation, leaving behind notes describing their inability to cope with both their traumatic experiences and society's refusal to believe their accounts. Others struggled with ongoing physical and psychological problems that were never properly addressed by the medical establishment. The abandonment of the survivors created a secondary tragedy that extended the Institute's impact for decades. Family members who tried to care for traumatized survivors often faced financial ruin and social isolation. Children of survivors grew up in households marked by unexplained trauma and received no support or explanation for their family situations. Many survivors developed severe mental health problems that were dismissed as hereditary mental illness rather than being recognized as responses to trauma. The lack of official acknowledgement meant that survivors and their families were denied access to support services and were often blamed for their own suffering. The medical community's response to the Vexley scandal demonstrated a systematic effort to protect professional reputations over acknowledging patient abuse. Medical societies and journals refused to publish articles about the investigation or its findings, arguing that unproven allegations could damage public trust in physicians. Medical schools eliminated references to Vexley research from their curricula and libraries, effectively erasing decades of documented experimentation from official medical history. Professional associations continued to honor Vexley family members for their contributions to medical science while ignoring evidence of their criminal activities. This institutional response created a precedent for handling scandals within the medical profession that prioritized protecting professional reputation over addressing patient harm. Medical schools developed policies that discouraged students and faculty from questioning established authorities or investigating controversial aspects of medical history. Professional organizations created mechanisms for suppressing inconvenient research findings and marginalizing physicians who raised ethical concerns about standard practices. The Vexley case became a template for covering up medical scandals that continued to influence professional behavior for decades. Eidsberg's elite families, who had been Vexley patients, worked collectively to suppress any remaining discussion of the institute or its practices. These families used their economic and political influence to discourage journalists, researchers, and former patients from pursuing the story further. Social and professional ostracism awaited anyone who continued questioning what had occurred at the institute, creating a climate of enforced silence that persisted for decades. Business leaders made it clear that continued discussion of the Vexley case would be viewed as an attack on Pittsburgh's reputation and would result in economic consequences for those who persisted in raising questions. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond Pittsburgh's elite to include ordinary citizens who had been touched by the Institute's activities. Neighbors of survivors learned not to ask questions about unusual behavior or family circumstances. Medical professionals avoided treating former Institute patients or providing care that might reveal evidence of abuse. City officials ensured that public records related to the Institute were sealed or destroyed, making future investigation virtually impossible. The entire community participated in a collective effort to forget what had occurred and to prevent any discussion that might revive uncomfortable questions. The physical location of the former Institute became a carefully managed void in Pittsburgh's urban landscape. The site remained vacant for over 20 years, with development proposals consistently rejected or abandoned for unclear reasons. When construction finally occurred in the 1920s, it was limited to commercial buildings with no residential components. Local residents reported that the area never felt quite right, though few could articulate specific reasons for their unease. The site's history was gradually forgotten as older residents died and new residents arrived with no knowledge of what had occurred there. Urban planning documents from the 1920s and 1930s show that the site was considered for various development projects, but each proposal was ultimately abandoned for reasons that weren't clearly documented. City planners noted that the area seemed to resist development and that construction projects experienced unusual difficulties and cost overruns. Some proposals were abandoned after workers reported discovering underground structures or materials that weren't shown on official building plans. The site's problematic history created a pattern of failed development that persisted until modern times. Efforts to investigate the Vexley case resurfaced periodically throughout the 20th century, but each attempt faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who tried to research the story found that key documents had been sealed, transferred to private collections, or destroyed. Academic researchers encountered similar obstacles, with access to relevant archives restricted or denied entirely. The few investigators who persisted in their research often experienced professional setbacks or personal difficulties that forced them to abandon their work. Graduate students who chose the Vexley case as research topics found that their advisors discouraged their work and that funding opportunities became unavailable. Professional historians who attempted to document the case found that traditional sources of information had been systematically compromised or eliminated. University archives that should have contained relevant materials reported that files had been lost or destroyed. Newspaper archives showed evidence of missing issues from critical time periods. Government records that should have documented the investigation were missing or heavily redacted. Family papers and personal collections that might have contained relevant information were donated to institutions that restricted access or were destroyed by heirs who preferred not to preserve potentially embarrassing materials. The ultimate legacy of the Vexley Institute remained visible in Pittsburgh's medical establishment for generations. Certain medical practices and ethical standards that other cities adopted quickly were resisted in Pittsburgh, as if the medical community feared that increased oversight might revive uncomfortable questions about past practices. The city's medical institutions developed reputations for secrecy and insularity that persisted well into the modern era, creating ongoing barriers to accountability and transparency. Medical facilities in Pittsburgh were notably resistant to external oversight and maintained internal review processes that were less rigorous than those adopted by institutions in other cities. This resistance to oversight created ongoing problems for Pittsburgh's medical community that extended far beyond the Vexley case. Patients reported difficulties obtaining medical records or getting explanations for unusual treatment outcomes. Medical professionals were reluctant to report concerns about colleagues or institutional practices. Regulatory agencies found it difficult to investigate complaints or enforce standards within Pittsburgh's medical establishment. The culture of secrecy that had protected the Vexley Institute continued to shield other problematic practices and made it difficult to ensure that patient care met acceptable standards. By the 1970s, virtually all direct survivors of the Vexley Institute had died, taking their first-hand knowledge of what occurred there to their graves. The few family members who inherited these stories were typically discouraged from sharing them publicly, warned that raising old allegations could harm their own reputations and economic prospects. Children and grandchildren of survivors often struggled with family histories that they couldn't fully understand or discuss openly. The institutional memory of the Institute's crimes was systematically erased through a combination of official suppression, social pressure, and simple passage of time. The loss of institutional memory created additional challenges for understanding the full scope of the Institute's impact. Genealogical research into affected families revealed patterns of trauma and dysfunction that persisted across generations, but the connections to the Institute were often lost or forgotten. Medical records that might have explained ongoing health problems in survivor families were missing or incomplete. Family stories that might have preserved important information were suppressed or distorted over time to make them more acceptable to discuss in social settings. The Vexley family name gradually disappeared from Pittsburgh's social and professional circles, though whether through deliberate concealment or natural extinction remains unclear. Genealogical research into the family's descendants has proven surprisingly difficult, with many records apparently lost or restricted. The few traces that remain suggest that family members continued practicing medicine in other locations under different names, carrying forward the knowledge and techniques they had developed during their decades of unauthorized human experimentation. Professional directories and medical school records show gaps and inconsistencies that suggest systematic efforts to obscure the family's subsequent activities and whereabouts. Modern research into the Vexley family's fate has been hampered by the systematic destruction of records and the family's apparent success in creating new identities. DNA analysis of samples from known family members has been impossible because no confirmed samples exist in accessible collections. Professional genealogists hired to trace the family's descendants have encountered unusual obstacles and have been unable to establish clear connections beyond the early 1900s. The family's disappearance from historical records is so complete that it suggests a level of coordination and resources that would have been difficult to achieve without substantial assistance from powerful allies. Today, the site of the former Vexley Institute is occupied by a modern office complex whose tenants include several medical practices and healthcare-related businesses. Few people in contemporary Pittsburgh know the history of the location or recognize the significance of the street address. The scattered evidence of what occurred there between 1847 and 1900 remains buried in archives, private collections, and forgotten corners of institutional memory, waiting for someone with sufficient courage and resources to piece together the full truth about one of American medicine's darkest chapters. The building's current occupants report no unusual experiences, though some have noted that certain areas of the building seem to have higher than normal staff turnover and that patients occasionally express unexplained discomfort in specific rooms or hallways. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.